This is not a review of Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds' Push the Sky Away. This is not an essay about Nick Cave, or the Bad Seeds, or Push the Sky Away. This is not an extended piece, treatise, or rant on what I would consider the best album of 2013. This is a piece about metatext, meta-narrative, and the lies therein. Be conscious of deception, because there will be points in this piece where I will be lying to you. And it's funny that just by saying that phrase, I have your attention, I'm already starting to make my point about metatext, because this is an album where the devil is in the details, unless God and the devil have been dead all along.
On the far side of the morning, who was it? Yeah, you know we real cool. I hope you're listening. Are you?
Part 1. The Scene. Some of you probably already know that I'm a writer. I've been published on multiple occasions. My first book was published in 2015. I script all of my content quite heavily. And one thing that has fascinated me for decades now is not just telling a good story. Millions of good stories have been told with men like myself at their center, and I've been bored of the whole tabula rasa framing for a while now. That's Latin for blank slate, although I prefer the cruder translation of scraped tablet, the implication that you've scratched off a layer that was already there to present something open to creativity. The way that a lot of traditional narrative is constructed is by placing my archetype as that tabula rasa, something for the presumed audience to project onto, and that can make for a good, straightforward narrative. But again, that's not what really interests me these days. That's an artificial simplification of how humanity works, or rather a projection of how some people want humanity to work within the structured confines of narrative. I've always been more interested in the stories about stories, where it's not just a simple narrative, but the mechanisms that create it. Dig into the mind of the author, and the tropes and ideas and methodology that informs that narrative. This broadly is metatext, where one artistic work makes commentary on itself or other works, which is also known as transtextuality, and we see it all the time. On the crudest level, a Family Guy cutaway gag, intended to make the reference simply for its own sake, or a lightweight joke at someone else's expense, oftentimes the audience. This is where you're going to find your parody and satire and deconstruction and abstraction. The latter two we're going to have to explore at some length here, although I will try to keep some distance from the French postmodern and structural philosophy schools that inform so much of how all this works. This episode's already going to be a tangled nightmare as it is. Strap in. Now, there is nothing wrong with a good, straightforward story, and I've already made a lengthy piece discussing why examining the author's presence is something that a vast quantity of people do not want to do, at least in good faith. That's a lot of work that many people see at best as kind of unnecessary, and at worst just the author jerking himself off, or at the very worst seeking to undermine the cultural narratives that we all hold sacrosanct. And let's be honest, there is some merit in that thought. Isn't art supposed to entertain, not just highlight the cleverness of the artist reflecting on his own creative processes? I mean, isn't there so much bad art already about self-absorbed artists wallowing in a facsimile of their own world that's not nearly as interesting or insightful as they think that it is? So enter Nick Cave in, let's say, the late 2000s.
'Cause I love you. Oh yeah.
It's important to highlight that Nick Cave was not always the critical darling that he is now, and even now you can tell for some it's quite begrudging. And this is because there is a lot of artistic tension in the music that Nick Cave creates. On the one level, he's a classicist, pulling on the trappings of high drama in refined, operatic arrangements and writing that show an acute awareness of classical art and myth and romance. On the other hand, he erupted from the garish trappings of post-punk post-punk, with a guttural, bellicose delivery, early spiked with heroin, and lyrics that could be blood-soaked and ribald. The gutter punk with the understandings and sensibilities of the finer poet. A brutal clash between Apollo and Dionysus, all the more charged by his embrace of Gothic Americana, which to many signified low melodrama. And yet more often than not, he was sincere in all of it. Coming out of the detached irony that soaked the 90s and much of the 2000s, Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds were outliers, where his biggest hit was a beautifully romantic ballad with Kylie Minogue where he winds up killing her with a rock. And it's sincere. And you're expected to take that seriously? That's not saying Nick Cave didn't play with humor or dramatic irony. He's smart enough to know when to take the piss out of his own sprawling iconography, but it also didn't always lead to the greatest returns. And in the late 2000s, it placed him in a, let's call it, interesting position.
'Cause she's a heathen child. Yeah, she's a heathen child.
He had found a wild creative outlet in the Grinderman side project, the sort of trashy and hilarious rockabilly experiment that was necessarily doomed to a short shelf life, but that was spilling into the 2008 album Dig Lazarus Dig, where the most telling song is We Call Upon the Author, which is just as graphic and insane, but so much of it feels like a reflection of the broader world, where Nick Cave has contempt for the nihilism of Bukowski and instead embraces a brighter, hedonistic wildness. But for what purpose, if things are only getting worse? It's a demand for answers that he's not getting, even as he wants to say it's all for its own sake, be it in life or art itself. And for a man who sprays forth so many stories, the lack of an answer could be maddening. But in other words, Nick Cave is going straight up his own ass. All the more ironic given that in 1989 he published the book And the Ass Saw the Angel. But keep in mind that it's not just Nick Cave making all this. You ignore the consternation of the Bad Seeds at your peril. And while multi-instrumentalist Warren Ellis took a more strident position in the group, Blixta Barghill left in 2003 after their worst album, Nocturama, and Mick Harvey left after Dig Lazarus Dig. The splits don't seem to be that acrimonious, although rumors tend to indicate there's a lot more we are not seeing, rumors that have persisted in music spheres and swirled around interviews for years. But it necessarily meant there was going to be a change in the sound for Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds when they recorded their next album, and thus, Part 2, The Speech. The first thing you'll notice about Push the Sky Away is that it doesn't sound like what you would expect from a Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds album. Now that shouldn't be much of a surprise. Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds have evolved their style over the course of decades. Another shift should not be that much of a surprise. From post-punk to goth rock to piano ballads to blues rock to garage rock to every elegant nightmare in between. Hell, going for a more reserved, quiet approach shouldn't even be a cause for concern. I mean, the first time the Bad Seeds did it, really, they produced The Good Son, the best album that they ever made. I'm going to let that hang in the air because I know the response to that brand of heretical propaganda, it might trigger something. But hell, the second time they did something close was The Boatman's Call, the album in 1997 that finally forced so many of their detractors to acknowledge that Nick Cave was a songwriter they could not just ignore or pigeonhole or deride. But this was different. It wasn't straightforward ballads or spare romanticism or the steady drip of menace. It felt different. The mixes were more sparse, haggard, where instruments would peel across the mist but then often recede. The first Nick Cave album I would properly describe as haunted. And it was an impression you could tell they were trying to create. The first song is titled We Know Who You Are, half ominous warning, half-written shorthand, where you get the feeling that the song is supposed to unnerve you in the echoing tones and faint backing vocals, but it doesn't quite get there. Something seems off. Now, in essence, that should not be that surprising, because something being off is an oft overlooked characteristic of Nick Cave's writing and presentation. Here's the most obvious example. For as much as Nick Cave can write some deliriously horny music, full of blood-curdling lechery, have you ever noticed how little his characters, his protagonist, actually get laid? There's a lack of deliberate satisfaction compared to so much of the hyper-masculine rock of multiple eras. Hell, that was at the root of so much of Grinderman. It was the one big reason why Nick Cave's writing tended to be a acquired taste at best. He didn't tend to give the audience exactly what they wanted, or if he did, he was going to add a layer to slyly undercut or challenge it. See All of Murder Ballads as the prime example. But here, Nick Cave is expanding that focus into the instrumentation and production as well, with the primary producer being Nick Launay, who worked with the Bad Seeds all throughout the 2000s and the 2010s, and has got a storied list of credits in his own right, spanning from Kate Bush to Idols. And what Nick Cave is doing is not uncommon on the more experimental side of singer-songwriter projects, especially on the postmodern fringes: abstraction. Taking the established principles of rock music and stripping away elements to challenge the structures of what rock is, what rock could be. This is not remotely new. Post-punk is a prime example of this, where the Bad Seeds and the Birthday Party started, stripping away the ruckus edges of punk, already a deconstructive art form as it is against Golden Age rock and roll, and then stripping it down to the more bare, rattling structures. And Cave has embraced some elements of deconstruction beforehand with the Grinderman project, stripping away the ornate layers of Abattoir Blues, the Lyre of Orpheus, to something filthy, but deceptively never satisfied. Here, the abstraction is expanded, though, barely even a trace of riffs or groove, with melodies that linger amidst an expansive mix full of negative space, prompting the audience to notice that absence and fill in the gaps with their own thoughts. Push the Sky Away would have some moments of gorgeous composition and arrangement, but it was a lot more subtle. The audience had to be willing to put in the work. And right from the start, Nick Cave made it very clear it was not going to come easy. This came in his delivery as well, more flattened spoken word proclamations than any singing or crooning or howling, and good luck tracing even a hint of narrative from the poetry he wrote. It was a lot more free verse, more abstract. And on a side note, it is worth highlighting that despite this album getting critical acclaim, it was the sort given to difficult albums where critics could tell something deeper and more potent was going on, but they couldn't really figure it out, which is why by the end of 2013, this album fell off a lot of year-end lists. And that's not counting the critics who just bounced off it hard altogether, and I can't really blame them. Nick Cave's writing was a thicket to untangle with the best of times, so now come with an album with the most restrained hooks he's had since No More Shall We Part, over a dreary, meandering expanse for an artist who spent a decade deliberately unsatisfying. I mean, I can see why folks didn't just have the time for it, or called it boring, inscrutable, and left. And to be fair, it wasn't like there wasn't precedent for this sound, because the past couple of years had delivered a slew of long, increasingly abstract singer-songwriter projects that tested everyone's patience, even despite the critical acclaim. Destroyer's Kaput springs to mind in 2011, or Bill Callahan's Apocalypse, or Bob Dylan's wildly overrated Tempest in 2012, alongside Clean Moon by Mount Eerie. And that's not even counting the wave of critically acclaimed ambient and post-rock albums, spanning from Godspeed You Black Emperor to Nicholas Jar or Tim Hecker. People tend to forget just how dense and challenging so many of those records were in the blog era of the early 2010s, in multiple genres, and throughout the next couple of years, there would be a shift away from that sort of challenging, heady abstraction. So put Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds into all of that, after a decade of writing that didn't make it easy on anyone, look, I get it why some folks said, fuck it, I'm out. And you know, even if you were sticking around, this doesn't feel like a fun album. I used the word haunted before, and it resonates for how much this album dwells on decay, words and scenes of the past left hanging, where the only scaffold they have is memory, and that's a shaky scaffold at best. We'll come back to it. Right from the first track, the trees might glisten with dew and new life in the morning, but burn by evening. The next song, Wide Lovely Eyes, is a hint of longing romance. Many people think that Nick Cave wrote the song about his wife by the shores of Brighton where he lives, but it's also a song of expectant loss at the water's edge, where there seems to be so much yearning in those eyes that Nick Cave seems to know will fade. Why else does he describe a carnival by the water's edge all closed up, with the mermaids strung up by the streetlights by their hair? Not the first time that mermaids are mentioned on this album either, we'll come back to it. Nor is the water's edge, which comes up on the next song of that name. And it's the first moment that feels like a properly skeevy Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds song, with the girls coming down from London and the local boys that want to graphically fuck them from every angle. But there is more going on than just Nick Cave watching young amorous hookups of which he does not, maybe even cannot participate. Note the mantra of "you grow old and you grow cold," because it doesn't seem like the local boys are having much luck either. The most memorable line outside of the chorus is "reaching for the speech and the word to be heard." And there are a number of ways one could interpret this line, likely as catcalls. Could be a search for God through orgasm, or wherever the hell they think they can find it. Or it could just be a desire to cut past the white cords in the girl's ears. A passing reference to modernity, where it's always interesting when Nick Cave includes those details. But let's jump ahead briefly to Mermaids, the fifth song on the album, and one that it feels like it culminates well from the water's edge and wide loving eyes. Not just in the mermaids reference directly, but how it frames religion. Nick Cave admits that he's got belief in God, but about as much as he believes in mermaids, or the rapture, or any other siren that draws men out into the deep, of which he absolutely does, and is very cognizant of all that power over him. This is a simpler song that once again places him as the observer, but one with the lived experience, as his wandering eyes have gotten him into trouble in the past. He references driver awareness course, one he actually had to take after a car accident in 2010, and husband awareness course, which, I mean, if you're familiar with Nick Cave's relationship history, and even some of the songs I just mentioned, it does not require much explanation. But I think the usage of awareness is interesting, because he's also looking to be aware of those mermaids as well, despite their danger, or how true they might be, and how he finds it endearing how much they want to believe, and that will have much heavier implications later on. But circling back to the water's edge, it actually is the word speech that intrigues me so much, especially in the context of religion, because let's be honest, in Christian societies, words have power. In the beginning there was the Word. God spoke the world into beginning with Genesis, and with words comes structure, comes narrative, where culturally we tend to consider one smart if they read a lot of books. But what's very interesting is that Cave notes that these boys are searching for the speech. Even if they have it, they're not being heard. They're drawn to the girls shaking their asses. They want that perfect opening line. They keep reaching for the speech, the command, but it's telling how they never really shown that they get it. The will of love, the thrill of love, but left with the chill of love. The encounter does not ring as satisfying. No romance here. And yet when you think about it, even in context, that's a little odd. Yeah, it fits the context of folks not getting laid in Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds music, but this is not in the first person, but the third. The youth should be connecting in these nights of passion. Nick Cave is a romantic enough to embrace the power of these words, not resort to what otherwise sounds like a lot of sexual violence that would follow. And while that's also not surprising coming from Nick Cave, the words failing reflect something else. What's really going on here? Part 3, The Memory. Let's go back to metatext. On the simplest level, it's text about text, talking about something that already exists, perhaps placing it in reference to another text. In fact, let's strip away the constructed artifice of a parody or a satire, where there's a lot more in the creation or interpretation, the ascended form of what metatext could be, although put a pin in that for later too. Metatext can be far simpler than that, like say, the title of a song. The song itself is the art, the title is the most basic descriptor of what it is. Although the more technical term is paratext. For the purpose of differentiation, paratext creates the structure or threshold of discourse around a text. Metatext is commentary, and yes, they overlap, can be used interchangeably. Album art also falls in the territory. It creates discourse around what the song or album is trying to say. So is a lyric sheet, in that it explicitly describes what's being said. It's one reason why rapper Mac Homie actually refuses to post his lyrics anywhere online, because he recognizes the value of that metatext and what it contributes to the value of his own text, that being his albums. Hell, the album structure itself is a form of metatext. These songs have meaning on their own, but putting them alongside each other in an order, that creates its own meaning. And guess what? The author does not control all the metatext around their art. I mean, that should be obvious, but it's actually more far-ranging than you might think. Reactions create metatext around the art and how it's consumed or interpreted. So does critique, or riffing, or parody. All these factors impact the conversation. And here's where I'm going to introduce a loaded assumption based off of some of the principles from my video essay from 2021. If I put forward that the initial, often fundamental experiment of art is rooted in emotion, naturally that emotion impacts the metatext of the art if you choose to make discourse or have thoughts and opinions about it. That makes a certain amount of sense. Given how you feel in a certain moment's going to impact your opinion. And if you share that opinion, it's probably going to impact the discourse. And consensus and opinions can absolutely impact how art is taken in or consumed. And a poignant example comes with timeliness. How often do you hear that art is timely, like RTJ4 in the summer of 2020, with the following observation that RTJ4 could have been dropped at any number of points in American history and still feel relevant? And what does that say about the history of police brutality? That's metatext. That helps shape the major and relevant societal conversation around a piece, now society at large. So let's take the next step. What impacts our emotions when engaging with art? Well, there's a lot of things that can shape our metatextual emotions, beliefs, our desires, our identity with respect to the larger world. But a lot of the foundations behind that are in memory, our lived experiences that give us the information to support it. So memory becomes part of the metatext that we have in engaging with art. And that also makes sense, because as I said in my 2021 essay, it sets up expectations that if an artist engages us in one way, they can do it again. But we don't all share the same history or memories. And while there are those who want to dictate what that history is, it's never going to be a purely objective view. It's one reason I try to emphasize how much art is a conversation, because it can be fixed in time, draw common ground across different spheres of metatext tied to unique experiences, but not just between us and other fans, but also between us and the author. This is where I have to mention 20,000 Days on Earth, a pseudo-biographical, fictional musical documentary film that came out in 2014 that shows a snapshot of Nick Cave's life in the creation of this album. It is the only feature-length film at this time, directed by Ian Forsyth and Jane Pollard, and it's a classic example of text as metatext, a movie about the creation of this album, albeit fictional, capturing a 24-hour snapshot that features cameos from Nick Cave's life, a therapy session, plenty more, specifically marketed at Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds fans that want to get a closer look at what could have shaped this difficult album, but it's not pure documentary, compared to 2016's One More Time with Feeling, which was much more straightforward and a much tougher watch, especially in the context of the album that it was exploring. Now, Nick Cave also co-wrote 20,000 Days on Earth, and ergo I view it a little bit more authorial in the meta-context that Nick Cave was creating about Push the Sky Away. Where in the trailer, memory is mentioned explicitly in the context of being able to create art.
In a sense, because memory is what we are. Your very soul and your very reason to be alive is tied up in memory.
And is concerned with middle age that he's losing some of it. And memory and its loss, it's a theme that lingers heavily over this album, even where you think it wouldn't. Take Jubilee Street, where it describes a prostitute or madam that's got her history, but no past. Her business forced to shut down when the Russians moved in, but she leaves and contains a knowledge that leaves Nick Cave uneasy. As the second verse reveals, she's got a little black book. His name is on every page. You can't judge her for it. She adheres to her morals, but he hasn't. And that lingering sin is a chain that drags him down, a memory he cannot escape. He describes it as both a 10-ton catastrophe on a 60-pound chain, and the most infamous line of the album, like a fetus on a leash. A line that he's described in a Q&A as about rebirth. And you know, by the end of the song, as the strings swell up, almost reaching operatic heights, he describes that transcendence, where he feels beyond recrimination. He's now practicing what he preaches. He cannot be contained. Not eradication of that memory, but radical acceptance of it. What I find fascinating is the parallel to a much older Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds song, one of his staples, The Mercy Seat. It's a man on death row who's not afraid to go to his grave as an innocent man standing on principle, but in the final words, admitted he told a lie. You don't know what that lie is, but it exists. And it reflects the focus on memory of the album, because you can't escape it, no matter how much you desire. It shapes how the aging protagonist will see the world, what sins he's committed, whether they were even sins at all. And this album can be lurid in how it frames sex, violence, and both together, where even if characters can't verbalize what it all is, they're haunted by it. This is reflected in the movie as well, where sitting in the back seat as Nick Cave drives appears old members of the Bad Seeds, even Kylie Minogue herself. And that lived experience is his own haunting. Although again, haunting's probably the wrong word. And Jubilee Street has him invite those memories in, because otherwise. Part 4. My favorite song on Push the Sky Away is the 6th track. A track that's all menacing slow burn, coursing on the spare riffs and swells of strings. It's called We Real Cool. And it's worth highlighting, this is not the first piece of art with that title. That probably goes to the poem by Gwendolyn Brooks, written in 1959, where she describes the kids running wild, embracing sin, spitting in the face of authority, their lives sacrificed as a result. And Nick Cave's song is an expanded riff on that text, metatext in and of itself, but from the perspective of the higher power seeming to lament this truancy. A lot of folks extrapolate that it's God who gave you and the world so much that you seem to dismiss so casually, sparking both gifts of love and fear. But I'd argue it's more complicated, because the pronoun is we. Nick Cave includes himself. It's not pure homage, and he's not the stern figure of authority, the apocalypse prophet manifest. He's hoping you're listening, where from the ground it could feel very well like it's a cry for help. This is where some of the deeper focus is required on coolness. And while there is an entire video essay that deserves to be made highlighting how coolness is a cultural construct rooted in black culture, often as a necessary defense mechanism going back centuries that was often derided as often as it was appropriated, Nick Cave highlights the underlying disaffection. But the most important lyrics come in the final stanza.
Sirius is 8.6 light years away. Arcturus is 37. The past is the past and it's here to stay. Wikipedia's heaven. When you don't want to remember no more.
First 2 lines, they're trivia. But it's worth nothing that it'll take years for the light from those stars to reach humanity. An easy extrapolation of the distance to that higher power. But again, it's trivia. We can dump that in a user-run repository to be queried at any moment when we don't want to remember anymore. And you can extrapolate that as a metatextual challenge, the disaffected who cares moment, where we grow old and regrow cold as memory naturally begins to slip away. If you got a place where it's all being stored, why bother with your pedantry of interpretation? You don't have to reach for the speech when you're cool enough to get what you want regardless. Now, Gwendolyn Brooks's poem highlights how cool could bring about youthful defiance and pleasure, but exact a cost. Nick Cave's age widens that framing, highlights what can happen when we so easily throw away our memory, with the true terror coming in the realization we might not be able to help or stop it. After all, memory is the key. But what Cave knows is that if Wikipedia is heaven, there's trouble in paradise, because Wikipedia can be edited by anyone. And so much outright false or incorrect data proliferates across that site, nobody's got the time to correct it all. And Nick Cave expands on this metatextual connection on the next track. Where We Real Cool builds on the foundation that Gwendolyn Brooks built, finishing Jubilee Street speaks on Nick Cave writing about finishing the lyrics of another song on this album. Jubilee Street was all about grappling with the records of his transgressions coming due, but now he's shifting the focus to a muse that he believes that he had married that is not his wife, a shadow that cries out for lost children. The choice of name for said woman is Mary Stanford, which some have extrapolated to be an 18th century English prostitute, executed for pickpocketing in 1726 after a drunken client reportedly forced himself upon her, and notably, she chose death rather than get deported to serve as a slave in the colonies. Now, the writing of the time around her case that I was able to find is gross, describing her indifference to her children by multiple men, and how every time she was granted a servant role, she failed in it, finding more success as a woman of the night, rather die than become a slave again, of which the men and the authorities of the time just could not comprehend. It's worth highlighting that the justice system of the time basically believed nothing she ever said, where surely our justice system would be so much better hundreds of years later when discussing someone willfully trying to survive in sex work. But Nick Cave does seem to believe her. But despite his care in the moment, there's a different kind of exploitation going on, and he knows the culpability. His own, not just in how Jubilee Street frames sex work around his own demons, but the metatext coming in claiming her story for another song all about finishing his first. He might have remembered that story, but how much of that is his story to tell, especially with a more modern frame of reference? It's layers upon layers of metatext stacking on top of each other. And what is true? And here's where we're going to have to talk about album packaging. That's not something I ever focus on in any of my discussions about albums, but there's something very revealing and strange that needs to be explored here because it reinforces the theme. As seen in 20,000 Days on Earth, Nick Cave types his lyrics on a typewriter, and that means whenever he makes mistakes or needs to correct something, there's a lot of scribbling notes, blacking out words. It's a messy process, and he includes a lyrics printout for every song of the vinyl on the album. That's pretty common. Artists normally include the lyrics with some sort of printout, but with Nick Cave, it's significantly messier, because you see that creative process splattered across the page, fidgety refinements of words and stanzas and verses, entire lines removed, and then it gets worse. The printouts that we get are not accurate to the songs on the album. Some of the scribbles in the margins line up, but some don't. And then there are songs that are just outright missing whole stanzas and lyrics. We'll get to the album's penultimate track soon enough, but it's missing everything after the fourth verse with just the word continued stamped at the bottom, which seems like cursive upside down overlapping that fourth verse. The verse that I shared from We Real Cool, it's not in the printout at all. And finishing Jubilee Street is basically unrecognizable from the heavily blacked out verse we see in the printout. Now, the easy answer here, it's all artistic license for some neat packaging, and then I'm giving all this way too much attention. Folks are gonna look up the lyrics proper on a user source site, like Genius anyway, but we know what Nick Cave thinks about that sort of reference guide, and the reason you print out these lyrics at all with the vinyl is as a reference. So why make the paratext so much of a mess if you're not trying to expose how easily the artist can shape the narrative or outright lie? and maybe not even know it himself. And Nick Cave's a stickler for detail. He has been for decades. It's one of the reasons he believes in not changing questionable language in old songs, a very loaded and contentious argument that really challenges how art can be perceived over the passage of time and the emotional response to it. But you want to know the biggest metatextual lie of this packaging, which some might just ring as an inconsequential Easter egg, but to me feels all the more telling? Because attached to each song is a stamp with Nick Cave's name and the date. Some songs have one stamp, some have two. There's a date discrepancy only with Mermaids and the closing track. It's not really clear whether it represents whether he started or finished the song. Again, none of this is clear. Hell, on finishing Jubilee Street, there's also a stamp of the Library of Victoria that tells me Nick Cave may have been doing his historical research there. The only song with such a stamp. But that song is dated twice. On May 3rd, 2012, a song with the opening line is, "I had just finished writing Jubilee Street." The lyrics printout of Jubilee Street is stamped on May 5th, 2012. Either Nick Cave is a time traveler to write a song about finishing a song he hadn't started or finished yet, the paratext or metatext is deliberately obfuscating any record, or I'm paying way too much attention to the metatext of an album because it could just be another artistic foible. Nobody would even know. I guess even if I asked Nick Cave himself, he might not remember. Wouldn't that be damning?
Can't remember anything at all. Flame trees line the streets.
You could write an essay on Higgs boson blues by itself on this album, and it probably would not be enough. Many have justifiably placed this among Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds' essential artistic canon, even if they don't like the song. A feverish behemoth that roils and surges and just goes places you would never quite expect. And to think that it was described as a partially improvised piece by Nick Cave and Warren Ellis is even more telling. And side note, a word about improvisation, when artists often say that, it's often built with a paratext that they've got ideas where they want to take the song, maybe even phrases or lines that are worked out in their heads before they deliver them live. It's not all just off the dome that they're coming up with this all on the spot. Hell, when I put together this piece, I had whole sections written in my own mind before I even put them down. Just a matter of remembering them. And thus, in this case, the easiest place to start is with the Higgs boson itself. Without getting into the weeds of particle physics and to generalize very broadly, it's responsible for generating mass in a quantum subatomic system, theoretically discovered at this point in 2012. But you don't need to know physics. You need to know the other name for the Higgs boson was the God particle, where if discovered, said Higgs boson would complete the standard model of particle physics. As someone with a physics background, it should be noted that physicists really did not like the term, and even completing a model does not mean that there isn't massive holes to fill and a lot more further research to do. But when you have such a compelling and marketable term attached to a best-selling book by Leon Lederman, and that drives research dollars into the CERN Super Collider, I mean, they're not going to about to bite the hand that feeds now, will they? But Nick Cave is not interested in the trivia. We know this. He's got a bigger, ineffable question. Because if a physics theory, a particle, can expose an understanding in the universe of science, where does God come in? Man has a stark, data-driven way to challenge a higher power. What does that mean for the world? Keep in mind the Greek root of apocalypse is uncovering. Where to go to the Bible, it's revelations. But Nick Cave does not see a great beast rise from the deep as the trumpets sound and seven seals break anew. Now he sees the world grow hotter, where memory becomes blurry amidst the fever, where he knows he has to drive down to Geneva where CERN is, where he must go face a crisis of faith, because when you rip away the sanctified veils, it exposes what religion can really be. And that's enmeshed in Metatext. The first full verse being all about music. He references the old legend of Robert Johnson summoning the devil to learn the blues at the crossroads of 4 black roads, and Nick Cave notes that Johnson didn't sell his soul for them, even if he did die young. He may have taken something that Lucifer's never been able to reclaim, especially as that was an easy way to discount a black man's work, because if there's no God, there's no devil either. And Nick Cave doesn't stop there, looking at black music as he then goes to Memphis and talks about the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel. And isn't there a cruel irony that Dr. King's message of black power, socialism, and liberation was far more in line with what Jesus actually spoke than the hypocrites that pulled the trigger to gun down a man of God? And the hypocrisy of doctrine burns further, as Nick Cave references the ghettoization of the Jews in the 9th century and how that persecution lingers. Then it goes straight to target African colonialism, with the missionaries who brought slavery and plague and rapacious industry under the guise of saving the savages in the name of God. But when your God can be contextualized in ruthless statistical curves and atomic data, how much are your atrocities worth now? And yet, given this is 2013, that was not the reference that drew the most attention to this song. No, it was Hannah Montana tours the African savannah, and Miley Cyrus floats in a swimming pool in Toluca Lake. Should be widely noted that this album came out well before Miley Cyrus herself had an eventful 2013, and before the majority of her controversies surrounding the rampant appropriation of black art roared to the forefront. Even Cave has admitted that her name and the show were more used for the rhymes, a fitting symbol of shallow American empire than anything else, with its own brand of Christian nationalism. Her name, her presence was only here on the mind because he went to a wax museum and saw more young girls flock to one of Miley than Elizabeth Taylor, one idol replacing another. This one might have white cords in the ears. Because that's the telling thing. To some, Higgs boson blues seems like a brutal deconstruction of religion and the society around it, in the overheated fugue state in an unstructured song ripped free of conventions of composition. Nick Cave observes a scientific revelation drive in its steely knives into the old beast, the old sanctuary of church and everything done in its name. Revelations ripped to light, and his art is not immune. He knows the roots of his Gothic Americana. It's baked deep into black art, especially blues and gospel. It's a metatextual culmination for the album as well, for a project where it's abstracted compositions, the production, the writing. It's intended to create a space for the words to hang, challenge the audience amidst the expanse, where the memory is the key. You can't remember anything at all. All you are left with is horror and truth, where the realities of those old systems are laid bare. But I want to make the careful distinction. It's not explicitly deconstructive. It utilizes metatext and how it pulls from so many different works, operates far removed from traditions of genre, and that would frustrate the Jordan Petersons of the world, even beyond the justifiable carnage that Nick Cave will wreak on the corrupt status quo. But Cave's a classicist at heart, and he seems to have as much contempt for nihilism as Jordan Peterson does. Go back to We Call Upon the Author. Where I think alienation would strike between the two is Peterson's philosophical limitations, where he'd turn back to his old ways and cling to the individualist fervor and faith, the man who would always be reaching for the speech, support the young men doing so, despite what they might wreak. Say nothing of the blind spots evident in the histories and the stories that he wants history to be. Nick Cave's got a wider lens. He's got to look forward. He doesn't shy away from the ugliness, he never has. One idol will replace another. Memory slips even further from his grasp and he's left clawing for anything that can remain, only knowing he's got to walk across another black crossroad, across the funeral pyre.
Hey, yeah? You ever wonder why we're here? It's one of life's great mysteries, isn't it? Why are we here? I mean, are we the product of some cosmic coincidence, or is there really a God watching everything, with a plan for us and stuff? I don't know, man, but it keeps me up at night.
The album ends at its quietest moment, Fires had guttered, the ashes strew against the chilly early morning dawn. More than anything, it feels like a hushed wish, a benediction, a prayer, even as the question of a god lies dead on the lips. It'd be so easy at this point to succumb to nihilism, a belief in the meaninglessness of life, the absurd, where Nick Cave could then finally add the questions to narrative itself, which would actually happen on an album later in the face of unspeakable tragedy. Yet he doesn't. He so very easily could let the memory go quietly into that good night, succumb to being real cool, but he can't do it. Not here. It's a new order, a new world before him. He's acknowledged every shackle and leash that might hold you back. So many of them coaxed in the memory of old sins, where he's not sure to whom they'll be called account beyond his own soul. But he's got to keep trying. If he feels he's got everything he needs and he can find the cold comfort, he's got to keep looking. And even where it doesn't make sense, where the metatext tangles and contradicts itself and the imagery is more stark, implying the misty truth and laying forth doctrine, he has to keep pushing. And here's the reality about metatext, the metatext I've created around the album with this piece. None of it may be fully true. I opened up this with some pretty words, the statement that I am lying to you, but more by omission than by choice. Because I can't know everything, and as memories fade and flicker, more slip away. You're left in the second childhood, reaching for the speech and the word to be heard, and fewer who will listen. And it's one reason I have no time framing this like an Easter egg hunt and petty resurrections. Trivia without context is meaningless, and while I've created a context wrapped around thousands upon thousands of words here, it's simply my own metatext. It can't be considered atomic truth. I mean, I might reach for the speech, but who knows if that speech is accurate. That creates uncertainty. And while some of us like to say they thrive in chaos, the majority of us don't. Certainly not for long without memory in our wakes becoming our own boulders, our own fetuses on a leash, or we wind up hanging the mermaids by their hair to the streetlights. It's so easy to succumb to disaffection, irony, apathy, especially when it's so much easier than staring forth into the future brink. Doesn't mean we should stop. It just makes it so much harder to keep going. But if we have to give life meaning, we have to keep pushing at that unknown, and I'm writing this a day after I returned from vacation. While I was there, I had to confront some pretty harsh truths about myself. I recognize why The Good Son resonates so very deeply with me. Because it's the tale of a man who believes himself to be good and is then tested at every angle to expose every single flaw, every moment where he'll buckle under his humanity, especially in the face of the uncaring world where it'd be so easy to believe the worst. Push the Sky Away sprawls further than that personal story, but it touches the same elements. The changing but uncaring world, where every iota of your fallibility is on display, where succumbing to nihilism isn't just expected, it's pragmatic to survive. It's easy to believe that doing good is something to show that you're good without really embodying it in reality. Virtue signaling, because nobody would believe you're actually good even if it's all for its own sake in your heart. Cynicism and cool go hand in hand, after all. And there would be no reason to spend so many hours putting together a messy, tangled, overly cerebral piece that'll never justify its effort in the traffic. Celebrating a difficult album already slipping into memory. How much good does one overlong, indulgent passion project provide or provoke anyway? But you do it anyway. You do it because you want to. You do it because you have to. You do it because it moves you. It stimulates you. It gets you right down to your soul. You do it because while you cannot control how the world sees you, and while your understanding will be fundamentally incomplete by its very nature, extending empathy across that expanse, as Nick Cave does across folds of time, past and future, to those already forgotten, it's something that makes our world a little better. This is not just some aspirational sentiment. This is a platform built over a decade that y'all gave me. And while I could make the extremely obvious quote, this is the one that's better about power and apropos to the album.
What is needed is a realization that power without love is reckless and abusive, and that love without power is sentimental and anemic. Power at its best. Power at its best is love. implementing the demands of justice, and justice at its best is love correcting everything that stands against love.
I have no illusions that this album or anything here is some grand statement against power structures, or functions as more than just a commemoration of a spectacular album before it slips away into the folds of time. Hell, the album itself is not that. Again, it shows a world where the old ways burn and are reborn in strange shapes, where Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds are more observers who second-guess every stroke of the pen, coax through the memories that make them who they are, makes us who we are. And Nick Cave would rather live amidst the desolation of that reality, one that would grow even colder, even more agonizing in just a few short years, recognizing the brutality of his sins, the failures of those around them, rather than just detach. The title track is the song that's got the fewest notes or annotations in the lyrics printout. It requires the least paratext or metatext to understand, because there is a nobility in its seemingly futile purpose. It's a plea, a prayer to keep trying despite the vast emptiness for you to fall, and that you can be good in doing so, especially if by sharing, the weight of this world can feel a little less harrowing. And putting it here, in this moment, I have to believe that even though the likelihood of failure is far greater with this slipping into the desolation of the internet, you might find something too. Metatext can be memory. Memory is the key. And even if you question or doubt the crucible and how it and you are forged, what you might choose to unlock will push you something that you never expect. Thank you all so much for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I would be extremely grateful. It does feel a little weird to do promo because I kind of think I nailed the ending there, but hey, if you guys want to stick around, subscribe to the channel, share this video. It's not going to get much traffic otherwise, and I'm putting a lot of work into it. I'd love to see this go viral. That'd be really cool. But beyond that, though, if you guys want to help support these videos or have a long, lengthy argument with me about this, link to my Patreon is right over there. Again, thank you all for watching. I'm Mark. You're watching Spectrum Pulse. I'll see you next time.